This is Duke University.
As Professor Musa has stated, we have a sort of dearth of studies on institutions of knowledge transmission in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I would argue that this is part of a broader problem that we have, those of us that study Islamic Africa, which is that African Muslims have been sort of marginalized both within mainstream African studies and within mainstream Islamic studies. And the argument that I make part of the argument that I make in the introduction is that there are particular colonial and older racial reasons for this kind of dual marginalization. And they're basically rooted in the fact that late 19th century colonialists and Orientalists, and these were often the same people, had trouble seeing African Muslims as authentically Muslim and authentically African at the same time. They created a vision of Islam that painted it almost as the property and proper expression of the Arab genius, and therefore it was rife with stereotypes about Semitic culture. It was a text-based religion, it was a legalistic religion, and that the animistic essence of Africans was not something that could be easily reconciled with this essentially racially other tradition. The way that I say this in the book is that Islamic studies and African studies created a sort of blind spot. They asked certain sorts of questions, and basically African Muslims disappeared in this blind spot. Their very blackness hid them from sight. And this colonial construction of a kind of exotic, Islam noir was the title that was attached to it, Black Islam, as something that was explicitly or implicitly heterodox, exotic, unusual, some kind of, they often called it a bastardized version of Islam, that this was a construction that owed much to colonial racism, but also to earlier histories of slavery within the Muslim world, which is something that I've written about in other places and also which I write a little bit about in this introduction. And basically the argument is that both African and Islamic studies have been the heir, unfortunately, to this tradition of racial discourse. The argument in the Hadith is basically, look, if the Prophet, if the messenger of God decided that black people could be exemplars of knowledge and piety within Islam, it's about time for African studies and Islamic studies to wake up and consider them as such as well. And this is all the more pressing since Africa is probably the only continent in the world with a Muslim majority. Even conservative Pew Research estimates or slightly less conservative, but still probably conservative CIA World Factbook estimates suggest that the population of the African continent is somewhere between 43 and 48% Muslim. But if you look at sort of careful country profiles for some of the disputed areas, especially Nigeria, but also other places, you would see that the number could easily shoot up to 55% without much trouble. So this is a map that figures in the book. By the way, there are far many more Muslims south of this imaginary Sahara line that I'm drawing with this pen than there are to the north of it. At least 300 million Muslims in Sub-Saharan Africa and probably about 165 million in North Africa, so nearly twice as many, which is not, of course, what people immediately think of. There are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. There are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. There's a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. I could go on and on. And if you took my History of Islam in Africa class at Michigan, I would go on and on for about 10 minutes on that particular point. So imagine that you've been badgered with statistics for the next 10 minutes, and we'll move on. That's easy for us to imagine, right? The image that I like to use to sort of highlight this point, it comes from the Siyar al-Nabi, a 16th century Turkish history of the visual history of the Prophet. And this is the image that's meant to represent the victory adhan made by Bilal after the Muslims have been victorious over Quraysh. They return back to Mecca, and Bilal, a former slave, an African, climbs to the top of the Kaaba and makes the call to prayer. And there's a lot of sort of Arab paternalism that is expressed in some of those racialized pictures of sub-Saharan African Muslims. And the question that I ask is, did the Prophet of Islam have paternalistic condescension in his heart at this moment? Something tells me not.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.